The first time Pauline Garrison put a bullet through a playing card at 40 paces, her father did not cheer. He stood in the dust of the corral behind their soddy house, watched the ace of spades flutter to the ground with a clean hole punched dead center, and said nothing at all. He only turned away, rubbing at his jaw the way he did when a debt came due that he could not pay. Pauline was 14 that year, and she did not understand until much later that Wade Garrison had not been teaching his daughter to shoot. He had been trying, in his own broken way, to make certain that whatever came for him one day would not also come for her unprepared. He had simply never counted on the cost of that gift settling onto her shoulders the way his own had settled onto his. That was the spring of 1868, in a hard little patch of West Texas scrubland that would, 11 years later, still smell of creosote and cattle, and the particular dry heat that pressed down on a person like a hand. By then Wade Garrison had been dead 2 years, buried under a mesquite tree on a rise above the house he had built, and the whole of Rimrock County still spoke his name the way folks spoke of weather that had once flattened a town. Some said it with fear. A few said it with something like reverence. Nobody said it the way you speak of an ordinary man, because Wade Garrison had never been an ordinary man. He had been a gunfighter, one of the fastest and surest hands ever to walk into a saloon in the Texas Panhandle, and though he had hung up his pistols the last 5 years of his life and tried to die a rancher, the reputation clung to his grave like cactus spines clung to wool. It clung to his daughter, too, whether she wanted it or not. Pauline was 25 years old in the summer of 1879, and she had spent every one of those years since her father's death trying to prove that his blood did not make her destiny. She ran 300 head of cattle on land that was slowly going to ruin, kept books she barely understood, and prayed nightly that no drunk cowhand would ever again ride into her yard wanting to see if the old man's daughter could really shoot the way the stories claimed. She could. That was the trouble. She could shoot better than any man in 3 counties, and she hated it. Hated the way her hand knew a pistol grip the way another woman's hand might know a needle and thread. Hated that when trouble came, as trouble always seemed to come to the Garrison spread, her first instinct was never to run for the sheriff, but to run for the colt her father had left hanging on a nail by the door. She had sworn, the week they buried him, that she would never wear it. She had broken that oath more times than she cared to count, and every time she had felt the old man's ghost looking over her shoulder with something that might have been pride and might have been sorrow, and she had never once been able to tell the two apart. It was on a hot, bright morning in late June that Emmett Keller rode up the rutted lane to the Garrison ranch, leading a limping bay gelding and looking for honest work. Pauline saw him from the porch before she heard him, a tall shape against the shimmer of heat rising off the flats, moving slow and careful the way a man moves when he does not want to spook whatever he is walking toward. She had a rifle leaned against the porch post within easy reach, as she always did these days, but something in the unhurried way he sat his saddle, the patient set of his shoulders, made her leave it where it stood. "Morning," he called when he was close enough to be heard without shouting. He had a low voice, worn soft at the edges like a coin handled too many times. "I am not looking for trouble, ma'am. Just work if you have any to spare, and maybe a place for this horse to rest a leg that is giving him grief." She studied him. He was maybe 30 years old, sun-darkened, with a face that had seen hard weather and had not been improved nor ruined by it, only shaped. His clothes were plain and patched at the knee, his hat sweat-stained, his gun belt worn but not showy, the holster tied down in a way that spoke of habit rather than vanity. There was a stillness in him that she did not trust and could not name, and she had learned the hard way not to trust stillness in men who wore a pistol like it belonged to them. "We are not hiring," she said, which was a lie, because she desperately needed hands and could not afford to pay the ones she had. "I would work for a meal and a place to sleep in your barn until this horse can travel," Emmett said, dismounting slow, keeping his hands visible in the way of a man who had learned that lesson somewhere costly. I do not need wages I know you cannot spare, Miss Garrison. Word of your troubles has traveled as far as the Brazos. She stiffened at the sound of her own name in his mouth. You know who I am, then? Everybody this side of Fort Worth knows who you are, he said, and there was no mockery in it, only a plain, tired honesty. The gunfighter's daughter. I mean no insult by it. I am only telling you why I stopped here and not at the Hollies place 2 miles back, which I hear pays better and asks fewer questions. Why did you stop here, then, if not for wages? He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his gray eyes made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that a man was actually seeing her, and not the shadow of her father standing behind her. Because I have heard you are running that ranch alone since your father passed, with debts stacked up, and a man named Silas Crane sniffing around your water rights, and because a person alone against that kind of trouble ought to have at least one more pair of hands who is not afraid of hard work, Emmett said. I have got nowhere else particular to be, ma'am. I would consider it a fair trade. She wanted to refuse him. She wanted to tell him that she needed no man's charity, that she had managed 2 years on her own, and would manage 2 more if it came to it. But the bay gelding was favoring its off foreleg badly, the animal's flank trembling with the effort of standing, and there was something in the quiet dignity of the stranger's offer that cut through her pride before she could stop it. There is a stall in the barn, she said finally. You can doctor that leg yourself. I have liniment and wrapping. Supper is at 6. We will talk terms after that if you are still of a mind to stay. Much obliged, Emmett said, and touched the brim of his hat, and led his limping horse toward the barn without another word, and Pauline stood on the porch a long while after he had gone, wondering why her heart was beating faster than the moment called for. His name was Emmett Keller, and it took her the better part of 2 weeks to learn even that much about him, beyond the fact that he worked harder than any 2 hired men she had ever paid, that he was gentle with the horses and patient with the ornery old milk cow, and that he never once, in all that time, asked her to shoot anything to prove the stories true. That alone set him apart from every man who had ever come sniffing around the Garrison spread since her father died. She learned to watch for him in the mornings, the way he moved through the gray light before sunup already at work, mending fence line that had sagged for 2 years because she had not had hands enough to fix it properly. She learned the sound of his voice when he spoke to the cattle, low and easy, nothing like the voice she imagined a man might use who had killed for a living, though she could not say for certain that he had, only that something in his bearing suggested a history he did not care to discuss. It was Delia Hutchins, at the mercantile in town, who finally told her. That's Emmett Keller working your place, Delia asked one Saturday, weighing out flour with more interest in her face than the transaction required. The very same Emmett Keller who used to ride with the Rangers out of Val Verde. Lord, Pauline, you have hired yourself a man with a story. What story is that? Pauline asked, keeping her voice even, though her pulse had quickened. They say he was as good with a colt as any man in the state, back when he wore a badge, Delia said, lowering her voice as though the flour sacks might overhear. They say he quit after his partner was killed in a fight that Keller believes he should have won faster, should have finished cleaner, and that the guilt of that one dead friend has followed him from Val Verde to the Panhandle and back again. They say he has not drawn a pistol in anger in better than 3 years, not even when provoked, and some folks call that cowardice and some folks call it the wisest thing a fast gun ever did. Pauline thought of the way Emmett's hand never strayed toward his holster, even when the bunkhouse hands teased him rough, the way he had once talked down a drunk drover who came looking for a fight over a card game, using nothing but a calm voice and a steady, patient stare, until the man's temper burned itself out like a match with no more wick to catch. She had thought it strange at the time, a gunman who would not fight. Now she understood it was not strangeness at all. It was the same wound she carried, only worn on a different side of the same coin. That evening she found him at the corral fence, watching the last of the light bleed orange across the flats, and she came and stood beside him without asking permission, which was not something she did with most men. "Delia Hutchins tells me you used to ride with the Rangers," she said. Emmett did not turn from the fence. "Delia Hutchins tells everybody everything eventually. I am only surprised it took her this long to tell you." "Is it true?" "Some of it." He was quiet a moment, turning his hat brim slowly between his fingers. "I rode with the Val Verde Company for 4 years. I was good at it, Miss Garrison, which is a shameful thing to admit out loud, but there is no sense lying to you about it. I was fast, and I did not miss, and for a while I believed that made me something like righteous, doing the Lord's work with a Colt in my hand." "What changed?" "A man named Reuben Foss changed it," Emmett said, and his voice had gone rough and low, like a wagon wheel dragging over gravel. "He was my partner. We rode together 3 years, through worse trouble than I care to describe to a lady, and I trusted him the way you trust your own hand to do what you ask it to. We went after a pair of horse thieves outside Sonora, and it should have been simple, and I was slow. Not much, a half a second, maybe less. But it was enough that one of those thieves put a bullet through Reuben's chest before I could put one through his, and I have spent every day since wondering what kind of man hesitates a half-second when his partner's life is riding on his speed." "You were not slow because you were weak," Pauline said quietly. "Maybe you were slow because some part of you did not want to be fast anymore. Maybe some part of you was already tired of it." He looked at her then, really looked, and something passed between them in the fading light that neither one of them was ready to put a name to. "That is a kinder way of saying it than I have ever managed myself," he said. "I understand it better than you might think," Pauline said. "My father made me fast before I understood what fast costs a person. I have spent every day since he died trying to convince this whole county that I am not what he was, that inheriting his eye does not mean I inherited his life. Most days I do not think anybody believes me." "I believe you," Emmett said simply, and it was such a small thing to say, and it undid something in her chest that she had kept locked tight for 2 years. They stood at the fence a good while longer, not speaking, watching the sky go from orange to violet to the deep blue-black of a panhandle night, and when Pauline finally went in to bed she lay awake a long time, listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods, thinking about a man who understood exactly what it meant to be haunted by a gift he had never asked for. Trouble came, as it always seemed to come to the Garrison spread, on the heels of that fragile new peace, and it came wearing the shape of Sela's Crane. Crane owned the Bar C, the largest spread in Rimrock County, 40,000 acres running clean down to the river, and he had wanted the Garrison water rights for longer than Pauline had been alive. Her father had refused him a dozen times over the years, and there was more to that refusal than simple stubbornness over a creek, though it took Pauline until that summer to learn the whole of it. Crane rode up to the ranch himself on a Tuesday afternoon in July, flanked by 2 hard-faced men Pauline did not recognize, and he sat his horse at the edge of the yard like a man inspecting property he already believed belonged to him. "Miss Garrison," he said, touching his hat with a courtesy that did not reach his eyes. He was perhaps 55, silver-templed, dressed too fine for a working ranch, with the soft hands of a man who gave orders rather than carried them out. "I understand you have taken on new help." "I have," Pauline said, standing on the porch steps with her arms crossed, aware of Emmett somewhere behind her at the barn, aware that he had gone still and quiet the moment Crane's party rode into the yard. "A ranger, no less," Crane said, and there was something ugly curling at the edge of his smile. "You do keep interesting company, Miss Garrison." First a father who could put a man in the ground before that man's hand cleared leather, and now a ranger who once did the same for a badge. One wonders if you attract such men, or if they are simply drawn to the smell of trouble that hangs about this place. "State your business, Mr. Crane, or ride on. I have work to do." "My business is the same as it has always been," Crane said, his smile fading into something colder. "That creek runs through your land and my land both, and my herds are thirsting worse each season, while your father's ghost keeps you too stubborn to sell me the water rights at a fair price. I am prepared to offer you handsomely for the north section, Miss Garrison. More than the land is worth, if truth be told. My father refused you for reasons I have never fully understood, Pauline said, and until I do understand them, I intend to honor his refusal. This land is not for sale. Something flickered across Crane's face at the mention of her father's refusal, some old wound reopening beneath the polished surface, and for a moment Pauline glimpsed the true shape of the man beneath the fine coat and the careful manners. Your father was a murderer with a badge of respectability he did not deserve, Crane said, his voice suddenly low and shaking with a fury that had clearly been simmering for years. He killed my brother Amos in the street outside the Alamo Saloon in Fort Griffin 11 years ago, called it a fair fight, and the whole territory believed him because Wade Garrison's word carried more weight than any Crane's ever would. I have waited 11 years to see that debt settled, Miss Garrison, and I find it a fine sort of justice that it should be settled with his own blood. The yard went very quiet. Pauline felt the old, familiar cold settle into her stomach, the cold that came whenever her father's past reached out from the grave to touch her present. I did not know my father killed your brother, she said carefully. If it was a fair fight, as you say, then the debt was settled the day it happened, under whatever law governed such things at the time. I will not pay for a killing I had no part in and no knowledge of. You will pay in whatever coin I decide you owe, Crane said, and though his voice had gone soft again, the softness was worse than the fury had been. I am a patient man, Miss Garrison. I have waited 11 years. I can wait a little longer if it means watching you lose this ranch inch by inch, the way you deserve to lose it. He turned his horse and rode out without another word, his 2 men falling in behind him, and it was only after the dust of their leaving had settled that Emmett came to stand beside Pauline on the porch steps. You heard all of that, she said. I did. My father never told me. 11 years, and he never once told me he had killed a man named Amos Crane. Some men carry their worst days alone because they cannot stand to see the weight of them reflected in somebody else's eyes, Emmett said. I would guess your father hoped that grave would stay quiet forever. Men like Silas Crane do not let old graves rest easy. What do we do? Emmett looked out across the flats where Crane's dust was still hanging in the still air. We watch, and we wait, and we do not give that man any excuse to move against you that the law would have to look away from. Crane is the kind of man who wants his revenge dressed up as justice. We do not hand him the costume. It was good advice, and for a while it seemed to work. August passed with no further visits from the bar C, though Pauline found herself sleeping with her father's Colt on the nightstand more nights than not, and she noticed Emmett had taken to walking the fence line each night before he turned in, checking the shadows the way a soldier checks a perimeter. Their evenings together grew longer as the summer wore on, sitting on the porch after the work was done, talking about small things and, gradually, larger ones. Emmett told her about growing up in a farming family in East Texas that had lost everything to a bad drought when he was 16, about how he had drifted west looking for work and found the Rangers instead, about the particular loneliness of a life spent moving from one temporary post to another, never staying long enough to plant anything that might grow roots. Pauline told him about her mother, dead of fever when Pauline was 9, about the strange, difficult love she had for her father, a man who taught her to read scripture with one hand and taught her to draw a pistol with the other, who had wept the day she outshot him for the first time and had never fully explained why. She told him about the 2 years since his death, the slow, grinding effort of keeping the ranch alive on her own, the loneliness of being both feared and pitied by the same town, the exhaustion of proving, over and over, that she was not her father's shadow. You are not, Emmett told her one evening, the 2 of them sitting on the porch steps while the cicadas sang in the dark. I have watched you 2 months now, Pauline. You do not carry yourself like your father's reputation. You carry yourself like a woman who built something with her own two hands and is not about to let anybody take it from her, not even his memory. It was the first time he had called her Pauline instead of Miss Garrison, and something in the sound of her own name in his low, careful voice made her chest go tight and warm at once. "I inherited his aim," she said softly. "Every man in this county knows it, whether they have seen it themselves or only heard the stories. I cannot undo that, Emmett. Some days I do not even want to because it has kept me alive more than once, but I will not become what he was. I will not let a gun be the first thing anybody thinks of when they hear my name." "They already think of it," Emmett said, "because fear is loud and slow to fade. But I do not think of it first, Pauline. When I think of you, I think of a woman up before dawn mending fence with her own hands, keeping books late into the night by lamplight, arguing with a stubborn milk cow like the animal owes her money. I think of a woman who has never once in 2 months asked me to prove I can still shoot, though half the county would have demanded it by now just to see the show." She turned to look at him, and the space between them on the porch step seemed suddenly very small. "I would never ask that of you," she said. "I know what it costs." "I know you do," he said, and reached out, slow and careful, the way he did everything, and took her hand in his. Her fingers were rough from rope and rain, calloused from years of work that most women in town would never have to know, and he held that hand like it was something precious rather than something to be pitied. "Pauline," he said, and there was a question in the way he said her name. "Emmett," she answered, and there was an answer in the way she said his. He leaned toward her slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and when she did not pull away he kissed her, soft and searching, and she felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight since the day they buried her father under the mesquite tree on the rise. It was not a kiss of desperation or of loneliness answered by loneliness. It was a kiss of two people who had each carried a heavy, secret weight for years, and had finally found somebody who understood the exact shape and heft of it. "I have not felt anything like this in a long time," Emmett admitted when they finally drew apart, his voice unsteady in a way she had never heard from him before. "I did not expect to find it on a struggling cattle ranch in Rimrock County, working for a woman who does not need saving." "I do not need saving," Pauline agreed, smiling for what felt like the first time in months. "But I would not mind some company on the road, Emmett Keller, if you are of a mind to stay a while longer." "I am of a mind to stay a good long while," he said, and kissed her again. The town of Rimrock held its harvest social the second Saturday of September that year, in the yard behind the church, with fiddle music and long tables of food and paper lanterns strung between the cottonwoods, and Pauline decided, against her own better judgment, that she and Emmett would attend together. It was a bold thing to do, and she knew it the moment they walked into the churchyard and felt the ripple of conversation stutter and turn toward them. Heads bent together. A few of the older women pulled their children a half step closer, as though proximity to the gunfighter's daughter might be catching. Pauline kept her chin level and her back straight, the way her father had taught her to walk into any room, and Emmett stayed close at her side, not touching her, but near enough that his presence spoke for itself. "You did not have to come with me," she murmured as they found a spot near the edge of the gathering. "I know what it costs a man to be seen standing beside me in this town." "I do not care what it costs," Emmett said. "I would rather stand beside you and be talked about than stand anywhere else and be comfortable." It was Reverend Aldous Pike who first crossed the yard to speak with them, a stooped, kindly man who had buried Wade Garrison 2 years before and had never once in all that time treated Pauline with anything but plain decency. "Miss Garrison," he said, taking her hand warmly, "I am glad to see you here. It has been too long since you graced one of our gatherings." "I did not think I would be welcome, Reverend." "Nonsense," Pike said, though his eyes flicked briefly toward the knots of whispering townsfolk with something like weary disappointment. "You are as welcome in this town as anyone, Pauline. More welcome than some, if I am honest, given how hard you have worked to keep that ranch alive with no help beyond your own two hands and now, I understand, the help of Mr. Keller here." "Reverend," Emmett said, shaking the offered hand. "I have heard good things about you," Pike said. "Delia Hutchins says you have not raised your voice in anger once since you arrived, and Holly's dean at the livery tells me you settled a dispute between two drunk drovers without a single blow struck. That is a rarer talent in this territory than fast hands, Mr. Keller, whatever your history might be." It was a kindness, offered plainly, and Pauline felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. But not every face in the churchyard held the same charity. She caught sight of Boone Hardy, one of the two hard men who had ridden with Silas Crane that day in July, leaning against the fence at the edge of the yard with a bottle in his hand and an ugly look on his face. And she knew before he crossed the yard toward them that trouble had followed her even here. "Well, if it is not the gunfighter's daughter," Boone said, his words thick with drink, loud enough that half the yard turned to listen. "Come to show off her fancy new gun hand at the church social. Fitting, I suppose. Even outlaws need the Lord's forgiveness now and again." "That is enough, Boone," Emmett said quietly, stepping half a pace forward, though he kept his hands loose and open at his sides. "Or what, Ranger? You going to draw on me in front of the whole congregation? I hear you have not drawn on a man in 3 years. I hear you froze up and got your own partner killed. Some hero you turned out to be, hiring on with a woman who cannot even sell a piece of land without her daddy's ghost telling her no." Pauline felt her hand twitch toward her hip out of old habit before she caught herself, remembering with a hot flush of shame that she had left her father's Colt at home, had wanted for one evening to be simply Pauline Garrison and not the gunfighter's daughter. Boone saw the twitch and laughed, a short, ugly bark of a sound. "There it is," he said. "That is the look, is it not, folks? That is the same look old Wade used to get right before he put a man in the ground. Bad blood does not wash out, no matter how many church socials a person attends." "Boone Hardy, you are drunk and you are trespassing on decent company," Reverend Pike said sharply, stepping forward with more steel in his voice than Pauline had ever heard from him. "You will apologize to Miss Garrison and leave this yard, or I will send for Sheriff Dean myself." "Ain't no need to send for anybody," Boone muttered, but he was already backing away, some flicker of shame or caution finally breaking through the whiskey. "I was only saying what half this town thinks and is too polite to say out loud." He stumbled off into the dark beyond the lanterns, and the yard slowly returned to its music and chatter, though Pauline felt the weight of a dozen curious stares still lingering on her like a physical thing. "I am sorry," Emmett said quietly once Boone was gone. "That man works for Crane. He came here tonight to needle you, and he chose his words to needle me as well. I should have handled it sooner." "You handled it exactly right," Pauline said, though her voice was not quite steady. "You did not draw, you did not give him what he wanted. That was not weakness, Emmett. That was the hardest kind of strength there is." "It did not feel like strength," he admitted. "It felt like standing still while a man spat on everything I used to be proud of." "I know that feeling better than anybody in this yard," she said, and took his hand, not caring who saw. "Let them talk. Let them whisper. We know what we are, even if this town needs more time to catch up." They stayed another hour, dancing once badly, to a fiddle tune neither of them knew the steps to, laughing at their own clumsiness in a way that drew a few genuine smiles from the watching crowd. And by the time they rode back to the ranch under a wide sky thick with stars, Pauline felt something had shifted between them, some final wall come down. The trouble with Silas Crane did not stay quiet for long after that. It was 2 weeks later, in the gray hour just before dawn, that Pauline woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of cattle bawling in distress, and came out onto the porch in her nightdress with her father's Colt already in her hand to find the North Hay barn engulfed in flame, orange light licking up into the pre-dawn dark, and 3 riders wheeling their horses away from the blaze at a hard gallop. "Emmett!" She screamed, and he was already running from the bunkhouse, half-dressed, rifle in hand, shouting for the 2 hired boys to get the horses out of the near corral before the fire could spread. They fought the blaze for the better part of an hour, hauling water from the well and the creek in a desperate relay, beating at the flames with wet sacking, and by the time the sun came up gray and smoke hazed over the flats, the barn was a smoking ruin and half a season's hay had gone up with it. But the house and the stock had been saved. Pauline stood in the ash-smudged yard afterward, her nightdress ruined, her hands blistered and black, and felt a cold fury settle into her bones that was worse than fear. "That was Crane's men," she said. "I recognized one of the horses. That was Boone Hardy's paint." "We cannot prove it," Emmett said, though his jaw was tight with the same fury she felt. "Not without a witness willing to swear to it, and every man on that ride would swear he was home in his own bed. Then what do? Let him burn us out an inch at a time until there is nothing left to inherit." "We go to Sheriff Dean," Emmett said. "We tell him what we saw, we let the law take its proper course, and we do not give Crane the satisfaction of seeing you reach for that colt in a fit of temper. He can twist into an excuse for worse." Sheriff Holly's Dean was a decent man, aging and tired, who had known Wade Garrison in life and had buried him with something like genuine grief, and he listened to Pauline's account with a grave, careful attention. "I cannot arrest a man on the strength of a horse's coloring, Miss Garrison," he said, not unkindly. "You know that as well as I do, but I will ride out to the bar see myself and have a word with Silas Crane. Sometimes that is enough to remind a man that this county still has laws, whatever his fortune might tempt him to forget." It was not enough. Sheriff Dean rode out to the bar see that afternoon and returned 3 hours later with a grim, unsatisfied look on his face. "Crane denies any knowledge of the fire," he told Pauline and Emmett when he stopped by the ranch on his way back to town. "Says his men were all accounted for that night. I do not believe him if I am honest, but I have no proof to move against him, and a man's word carries weight in this county whether we like the man or not." "So we do nothing," Pauline said bitterly. "You do exactly what you have been doing," Dean said. "You keep your temper, you keep your eyes open, and you let me handle Crane through the proper channels for as long as those channels hold. I would ask the same of any man in this county, Miss Garrison, gunfighter's daughter or not." He left, and Pauline stood watching his dust settle on the road, feeling the old, familiar weight of her father's legacy pressing down on her shoulders. It would have been so easy, in that moment, to strap on the colt and ride to the bar see herself, and settle the matter the way her father would have settled it, with speed and certainty, and a bullet that asked no questions of the law. She felt the temptation of it like a fever in her blood, and it frightened her more than the fire had. "You are thinking about riding out there," Emmett said quietly, watching her face. "I am thinking about it," she admitted. "I hate that I am thinking about it. I hate that some part of me believes it would solve everything quick and clean, the way my father would have solved it." "It would solve nothing," Emmett said. "It would only prove Crane right about you, and about your father, and it would put a rope around your neck or a bullet in your chest, and I am not willing to lose you to prove a point to a bitter old man who has spent 11 years poisoning himself with a grudge." "Then what do we do, Emmett? Truly, I am asking." "We wait him out," Emmett said. "We keep the ranch running, we keep the law informed, and we make certain that whatever happens next, it happens because Crane forced our hand, not because we went looking for a fight. If he means to push this all the way to violence, let it be on his conscience, not yours." It was sound advice, the same kind of hard-won wisdom that had likely kept Emmett alive through years of ranger work, and Pauline forced herself to swallow her fury and follow it, though the waiting cost her more than she let him see. October brought the harvest, and with it a brief, fragile peace. The rebuilt barn rose slowly from the ashes of the old one, with Emmett and the 2 hired boys working from dawn until dark, and Pauline found herself, in the quiet evenings after supper, teaching Emmett the small rhythms of the ranch her father had built, the particular creak of the windmill that meant the bearing needed oil, the temperament of each cow in the small herd, the exact spot along the creek where the water ran sweetest. It was during one such evening, the 2 of them walking the fence line together in the long gold light before sunset, that Emmett finally asked the question that had clearly been sitting on his mind for weeks. "Your father's Colt," he said. "The one you keep by the door. Do you still practice with it?" Pauline was quiet a moment. "Sometimes, early before anyone is awake to see. I go down to the creek bottom where the sound will not carry to the house, and I set up cans on the fence rail, and I shoot until my arm aches." "Why, if you hate what it represents so much?" "Because I am afraid of what happens if I let the skill go rusty and then need it," she said honestly. "Because some nights I lie awake thinking about Crane's men riding up out of the dark, and I know that if it ever comes to that, being fast and being sure might be the only thing standing between staying alive and not. I hate it, Emmett. I hate that I am my father's daughter in that one terrible way, but I would be a fool to pretend the skill does not matter out here, in a county where the law is one tired old sheriff and 40 miles between neighbors." "I do not think you are a fool," Emmett said. "I think you are the only person I have ever met who understands exactly what a gift like that costs, and who has chosen, every single day since your father died, not to let it define you. That is not weakness, Pauline, and it is not foolishness either. That is the hardest kind of courage there is, harder than mine if I am honest. I quit my guns and ran from what they had made of me. You never had that luxury. You have had to carry the gift and refuse the reputation both, every day, in the same county that watched your father earn that reputation with his own hands." She stopped walking and turned to face him, the low sun catching gold in her hair, and something in his words settled a question in her heart that had been circling there for weeks. "I love you," she said plainly, because plain was the only way she knew how to say a thing that mattered. "I did not expect to, and I did not go looking for it, but there it is, Emmett Keller. I love you." "I love you too," he said, no hesitation in it at all, the words coming as easy and certain as breath. "I have loved you since the second week, watching you argue with that milk cow like the animal owed you back wages. I did not say it sooner because I did not want to bring more trouble to your door than you already carried, but I am done being careful about it. I love you, Pauline Garrison, and I would be proud to spend whatever years I have left proving it to you." They married in the eyes of no preacher that evening, only in the quiet certainty of two people who had found, against every hard circumstance the West could throw at them, something worth holding on to, and it was 3 days later that the last, worst trouble finally arrived. Silas Crane rode into the Garrison yard at midday on a Thursday in late October, and this time he brought 6 men with him instead of 2, and this time there was no pretense of business conversation in his manner at all. Pauline came out onto the porch with the Colt already strapped to her hip, having seen the dust of their approach a full 10 minutes before they arrived, and Emmett stood beside her with his own weapon settled at his side, and the 2 hired boys hung back near the barn with rifles they barely knew how to aim but held anyway, because courage sometimes has to make do without skill. "Miss Garrison," Crane called from horseback, "I have come to make my final offer for the water rights, and I would advise you to consider it carefully, given the circumstances." "What circumstances would those be, Mr. Crane?" Pauline called back, keeping her voice level though her heart was hammering. "The circumstance that I have 6 men here who are prepared to do whatever is necessary to see this matter settled today," Crane said, "and the circumstance that your sheriff is 40 minutes away in town and has no earthly notion that anything is happening out here at all. I have waited 11 years for justice for my brother, Miss Garrison. I do not intend to wait any longer." "My father's debt, if there was one, died with him," Pauline said. "I owe you nothing, Mr. Crane, and I will not be bullied off land my family has worked for 20 years. "Then you leave me no choice," Crane said, and something in his voice had gone flat and final, the voice of a man who had already decided how this day would end before he ever rode out from the bar. "See, what happened next happened fast, the way real violence always happens, faster than the mind can properly follow," though Pauline would replay every fragment of it in her memory for years afterward, turning it over like a stone worn smooth by handling. "Boone Hardy went for his gun first," perhaps thinking to prove himself in front of his employer, and Emmett's hand moved before Pauline's did, faster than she had ever seen him move in the 4 months she had known him, the old ranger's speed surfacing from wherever he had buried it these past 3 years, and his shot took Boone through the shoulder and spun him from his saddle before the man had even cleared leather all the way. The yard erupted into chaos, horses screaming and wheeling, men shouting, gunfire cracking sharp and sudden in the October air, and Pauline felt the old cold clarity settle over her the way it always had in the rare, terrible moments when her father's training took over completely, her mind going quiet and precise, even as her body moved on instinct honed over a decade of practice at the creek bottom where no one could see. She put a bullet through the gun hand of a rider bearing down on Emmett's blind side, dropping his pistol before he could fire, not killing him, never once in that whole desperate minute aiming to kill, because some part of her, even in the heat of it, remembered her own vow, remembered that she had sworn never to become what her father had been, and she held to that vow even with her life and Emmett's hanging in the balance. Silas Crane himself drew on Pauline directly, his face twisted with 11 years of hatred finally given an outlet, and she turned, and her hand found her father's Colt, and for one terrible, suspended heartbeat she saw her whole life folding down into this single moment, the moment every story about her had been leading toward, the moment where the gunfighter's daughter finally proved the stories true. She was faster than him. She had always known she would be. In whatever moment this finally came, because her father had made certain of it, had drilled her past the point of thought into the realm of pure reflex, and her shot took Crane through the right shoulder before his own finger had finished tightening on the trigger, spinning him half around and sending his pistol spinning into the dust, and he fell to his knees in the yard with a cry of pain and shock, very much alive, very much beaten. And not one drop of blood spilled that had not needed to be spilled to end the fight. The remaining riders, seeing their employer down and 2 of their number wounded, broke and scattered, riding hard for the bar sea without a backward glance, and the yard fell suddenly, strangely silent except for the moaning of the wounded and the ragged sound of Pauline's own breathing. "Pauline," Emmett said, his voice tight with fear as he crossed the yard to her, checking her over with frantic, careful hands. "Are you hurt? Tell me you are not hurt." "I am not hurt," she said, and her voice was shaking now that the cold clarity had passed and left ordinary human fear in its wake. "Emmett, I shot him. I shot Silas Crane." "You shot him in the shoulder, same as you shot 2 of his men, and you could have killed every one of them if you had wanted to, and you did not," Emmett said, gripping her by the shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "You defended your home and your life and mine, Pauline, and you did it without taking a single life you did not have to take. That is not your father's reputation. That is something entirely your own." Sheriff Hollis Dean arrived 20 minutes later, summoned by one of the hired boys who had slipped away during the chaos to fetch him, and found the yard littered with wounded men and Silas Crane sitting propped against the porch steps, his shoulder bound tight with a strip of Pauline's own petticoat, cursing softly under his breath. "Well," Dean said, surveying the scene with weary resignation, "I suppose I finally have my proof." Crane was arrested that afternoon, along with Boone Hardy and the man Pauline had disarmed, on charges of attempted murder and arson. The burned barn from October finally connected in the telling to the men who had ridden away that night, one of whom, in his pain and fear, was willing to talk in exchange for a lighter sentence. The trial, held in the county seat the following spring, was brief and thoroughly documented in the testimony of Sheriff Dean and the surviving hired boys, and Silas Crane was sentenced to 15 years in the state penitentiary for his crimes. His vast bar C holdings sold off to satisfy the legal costs and settle old debts he had accumulated in his years of quiet cruelty. But it was not the trial that changed Rimrock County's view of Pauline Garrison. It was the story that spread in the weeks after the shootout, of how the gunfighter's daughter had fought off 6 armed men with nothing but her own steady hand, and had wounded every single one of them without taking a life, holding to some code of mercy that her own father, by all the old stories, had never quite managed himself. "She is not her father," Reverend Pike told the congregation the following Sunday, in a sermon that Pauline heard about second-hand and blushed to imagine. "She has his eye and his steady hand, that much is plain for anyone with sense to see. But she has a mercy in her that man never showed, not once in all his years of gunfighting. And I would ask this congregation to remember that the sins of the father are not the sins of the child, and that we have been unjust in our whispers about a young woman who has done nothing these 2 years but work herself half to death trying to keep her family's land alive." It was, Pauline thought when she finally heard the full account of it from Delia Hutchins, the closest thing to an apology Rimrock County would ever offer her, and it was enough. The whispers did not vanish entirely, because whispers rarely do, but they softened, and the wary distance the town had kept from her for 2 years began, slowly, to close. Emmett proposed to her on a cold, clear night in December, out at the creek bottom where she had spent so many secret mornings practicing with her father's colt, and he did it without ceremony or speeches, simply took her hand as they walked the frost-crusted grass and said, "I have been thinking, Pauline, that I have found the one piece of ground in this whole territory where I would like to plant something permanent, and it is not a piece of ground at all. It is you. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, before he had even finished the question properly, laughing through sudden tears. "Yes, Emmett Keller, I will marry you." And he kissed her there in the cold, starlit dark with a fierceness that told her, better than any words could have, exactly how deep his love for her ran. They married the following March in the little church at Rimrock, with Reverend Pike presiding and half the county in attendance, including a good many of the same women who had once pulled their children away at the sight of her. Delia Hutchins cried through the whole ceremony and claimed loudly afterward that she had known all along the two of them were destined for each other, which was a generous rewriting of history that Pauline chose not to correct. Sheriff Holly's Dean stood as witness, and remarked to Emmett afterward, with a dry humor that had grown on Pauline over the months, that he was glad to finally see the Garrison ranch settled by a man who could shoot straight and choose peace anyway, which he considered a rarer talent in that territory than most men possessed. They built a good life together on the ranch her father had started, and she had refused to let die. The barn Crane's men had burned stood rebuilt and sturdy by the following autumn, and the herd grew steadily under their combined effort. Emmett's steady hand with the cattle and Pauline's fierce, careful bookkeeping, keeping the operation solvent in a way it had never quite managed in the lean years alone. The water rights that had started the whole terrible chain of events remained hers, protected now not by threat or violence, but by the simple, unshakable fact that Silas Crane's empire had crumbled under the weight of his own hatred, and no one else in the county cared to take up his old grudge. Pauline still went down to the creek bottom some mornings, in the gray hour before the sun rose, and set up cans along the fence rail, and shot them down one by one with the same steady, sure hand her father had given her all those years before. But she no longer felt the cold weight of dread that had once accompanied the practice. She had used the gift once, when it mattered most, and had proven to herself, if to no one else, that she could hold to mercy even in the worst of moments, and that knowledge had settled something in her that had been restless since the day they buried Wade Garrison under the mesquite tree on the rise. Emmett found her there one October morning, a year and a half after he had first ridden up the lane with a limping horse and an offer of honest work, and stood watching quietly as she put 5 clean shots through 5 tin cans without a single miss. "Your father would be proud," he said, when she finally lowered the pistol and turned to him. "He would be," Pauline agreed, "though I think it took me a long while to understand that being proud of the aim and being proud of the person are 2 different things, and that he was always more proud of the second than the first, even if he never had the words to say so plainly. I think that is why he wept, that first time I shot him." He was not mourning the loss of being the fastest gun in the family. He was grieving that he had given his own daughter a gift that might one day cost her the peaceful life he had always secretly wanted for her and never quite managed for himself. "You have that peaceful life now," Emmett said, drawing her close, "gift and all." "I have it because of you," she said, "because you showed me that a person can carry a hard skill and still choose gentleness every single day, that the two things are not opposites, only choices renewed morning after morning. I do not think I would have believed that from anyone else, Emmett. I think I needed a man who understood the exact weight of it from the inside." They had their first child the following spring, a boy they named Wade Emmett Keller, in honor of both the grandfather he would never know and the father who had chosen, every day of his life since Sonora, to be gentle rather than fast. 2 years later, a daughter followed, Alina Rose, with her mother's steady gray eyes, and as it turned out, when she grew old enough to hold a slingshot with unnerving accuracy, perhaps a measure of her grandfather's gift as well. Though Pauline and Emmett made certain from the very beginning that both their children understood a skill was never the same thing as a destiny, that a steady hand could serve gentleness just as easily as violence, and that the choice between the two belonged always to the person holding it. The Garrison Ranch, which folks in Rimrock County had taken to calling the Keller spread by the time Wade Emmett was old enough to ride his own pony around the yard, prospered steadily through the years that followed, weathering droughts and hard winters the way all good ranches eventually must, held together by the same partnership of steady hands and stubborn love that had first taken root the summer Emmett Keller rode up a dusty lane looking for honest work and found, instead, the whole rest of his life. Pauline never did fully escape the old nickname. There were always a few old-timers around Rimrock, and later around the growing town that sprang up nearby as the railroad finally pushed through the county in the mid-1880s, who still called her the Gunfighters' daughter when they told the old stories to newcomers, embellishing the shootout at the Garrison Ranch a little more with each telling, until Sela's Crane's 6 armed men became a dozen and Pauline's steady, merciful aim became something almost mythical. She learned, eventually, to laugh at the exaggerations rather than flinch from them, because she understood at last the thing her father had never quite managed to teach her in all his careful, guilt-ridden lessons at the corral fence. That a reputation, once it takes root in a place, will grow whether you water it or not, and the only real power a person has is not in preventing the story from being told, but in living a life so full and so true that the story, however wild it grows, can never quite capture the whole of who you actually are. She was the gunfighter's daughter, yes, and she always would be, in the tellings and retellings that would outlive her. But she was also Pauline Keller, wife of a good and gentle man, mother to 2 children who would grow up knowing that strength and softness were never opposites, mistress of a ranch built on hard work and stubborn love rather than fear, and a woman who had, in the end, inherited her father's aim without ever once surrendering to his reputation. On quiet evenings, long after the children were asleep, and the ranch had settled into the deep, star-hung silence of the Panhandle night, Pauline and Emmett would sit together on the same porch steps where they had first held hands all those years before, and sometimes Emmett would take out the old Ranger's badge he had never quite been able to throw away, turning it over in his weathered fingers, and sometimes Pauline would rest her head against his shoulder and think of her father, and of the terrible gift he had given her without ever meaning to make it a burden, and of how strange and merciful it was that the very thing which had once threatened to define her had instead led her, step by careful step, to the one man in the whole territory who understood its weight well enough to help her carry it. No regrets, Emmett asked her once, years into their marriage, watching the last light fade over land that was fully and finally theirs. Not one, Pauline said, and meant it with her whole steady heart. I got my father's aim, and I got to choose what to do with it, and I chose you, and I chose mercy, and I chose this life. every single day since you rode up that lane with a limping horse and an honest offer. That is not a small thing, Emmett. That is everything a person could ask for." He kissed her then, slow and certain, the way he had kissed her that first night on the porch steps, and above them the panhandle sky wheeled its endless wash of stars, indifferent and eternal, watching over a ranch that had finally, after so many hard years, found its peace.